So last week I had a question about the parable of the 10 girls or the 10 virgins in the book of Matthew and what its purpose was for today. How do we understand it today? And I'm going to get to that question, but I need to do a bunch of theological throat clearing before I do that. So here we go. Imagine living in the year 4000 CE in the future, and you come across the 2,000-year-old writings and speeches and quotes from climate activists Greta Thunberg. And let's say you also happen to know that by the year 2050 CE, that the world's coastal cities, the Earth's coastal cities have been destroyed, and you ignore this, and you decide that Greta Thunberg was a prophet, prophesying not about 2050 CE, but about the year 4000, the year that you live in, about your cities, about your culture, and the imminent destruction of your cities. That's what we've done to the teachings of Jesus. We've made Jesus irrelevant to his own people at the time and made him only relevant to us today, which is suspicious. So let's get a couple things out of the way. One, definition: eschatology. Eschatology is the study of the end times or last things. The eschaton is the last thing itself. Eschatological would be like the adjective form. So that's definition. Number two, most American evangelical Christians' view of the eschaton or end times has been radically deformed by the sheer volume of left behind esch theology. And by volume, I mean both loudness and quantity. Since the 70s in particular, the Christian right has been putting out just massive quantities of shrill, alarm-raising material on the imminence of Christ's return and the rapture and of the fear of being left behind and of how every shot fired and foot shuffling in the Middle East or Russia is fulfilling a biblical prophecy. And all of those predictions, all of that material has been embarrassingly wrong, but the material keeps being printed again and again because gullible Christians keep buying it. It's basically like printing money. So one, definition, eschatology. Two, we've been misinformed about the eschaton. Three, Jesus never talked about his second coming. Jesus never talked about his second coming. And this is a really hard pill for folks to swallow. There are lots of famous verses that come out of the mouth of Jesus that we now assume have to do with the end times. Wars and rumors of wars and blood red moons and not one brick left on top of the other. And even the headings in Bible publishers, Bibles get this wrong. Matthew 24 is labeled as signs of the end times. And in many Christian imaginations, the phrase kingdom of God or kingdom of heaven gets confused with when we all go to heaven or when Jesus comes back. But Jesus never talked about his second coming. By the way, when I say the gullible Christians bought all this stuff, I was one of them for many, many years, at least until I got to college and had this sort of explained to me. Anyway, Jesus had a really hard time getting his disciples to understand his first coming and what that was all about, much less his death and resurrection. So why would Jesus spend so much time talking about something thousands of years in the future when there was a much closer crisis at hand? Why would Greta Thunberg be prophesying about the year 4000 when there's a much closer climate crisis at hand? That's not what Jesus was doing. Jesus was very explicit about the topic of his prophetic ministry. Jesus did prophesy, he did talk about the future, but not 1,000 years away future, but one that was very close and important to his people at the time. Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, this is the Olivet Discourse, make this very explicit. Jesus and his disciples, they're in Jerusalem. The disciples are pointing out the beauty of the temple. And Jesus is like, oh yeah, that temple, it's all going to be destroyed brick by brick. And the disciples are like, oh no, when? And Jesus answers that question. When will the temple be destroyed? Not some future temple that doesn't exist yet sometime in the future. Why would the disciples be asking about that? When is the temple that they are standing in front of going to be destroyed? So Jesus goes on for many verses explaining the signs that you should expect or should not expect. And he says the sign that you should expect is, and this is kind of funny when you hear it out loud, is when Jerusalem is surrounded by armies, which is kind of like a no shit Sherlock moment. But the reason Jesus needs to make this clear is that the Judea's leaders were getting more bellicose and cocky about their ability to overthrow Rome. And Jesus is like, hey, when you see an army surround Jerusalem, it's not the beginning of your glorious revolution, it's the sign of the end. Jesus makes this as clear as possible when he says, I assure you, everything I just told you is going to happen within a generation. This generation won't pass away before everything I just said will happen. And rapture theology end times folks bend themselves over backward trying to make this work with their predictions, but you don't have to do that. It all works because Jesus said this around 33 CE. Within 40 years, the 30th of July, 70 CE, Jerusalem is surrounded by Rome's army, led by the general Titus, and it is destroyed brick by brick, just like Jesus said. That's not to say that Jesus' words aren't still relevant for us today. They certainly are. We need to listen closely to Jesus when it comes to his teachings about fostering peace and creating revolutions that do confront evil without succumbing to violence. But for Jesus today to speak, we don't need to rip him out of his historical context and make him a prophet that's useless to his own generation. So, now that I've said all of that, now I can get into some more specific examples of how we've misread some New Testament scriptures, like the Gospels, like the parable of the 10 virgins or the 10 girls, or the parable of the sheep and the goats. It's not about Jesus' second coming. It's about something else.